Okay, hello everyone. This is Dee, and I welcome you to this particular session of just some things we're going to talk about this evening. We started off on the first episode, if you will, or the first outing, and we discussed the nature of communication. How, if you start with a transmitter and then a receiver of some sort, then communication takes place between this medium, from the sender to the receiver. We talked about the importance of having common understanding to make that particular conversation work. Because if we don't have the same meaning or even the same language, then it's impossible to get an idea from the sender to the receiver. And we went over at that time, in addition to those particular points, how it was necessary for the receiver to be listening, not simply hearing, not just reacting to the air molecules that were hitting their drums on either side of their head, but to be actively engaged in understanding what was being said, hence the need for the common meaning. So this time around, what we're going to do is we're going to hop on to a somewhat different topic, and this one we're going to talk about truth. And I've put up on the screen for you to look at the topics that we're actually going to talk about this evening. We're going to talk about objective truth. There are actually a couple of types of truth in major categories. There's objective truth, which is the topic for the day, and it follows those general rules that I've laid out before. And then there's subjective truth, or temporal truth, truth that actually exists for a period of time, but may not actually be the true or factual representation that you think it is. So let me give you an example of a truth that we're all taught, which is in fact not an objective truth, it's a subjective truth. And that is, if you remember, as a young child, you were introduced to the color of the sky. And if you asked your mother and father, what they would tell you is the sky is blue. And to a certain extent, that's true. It appears to be true, but in actual fact, it is not true. The sky itself is colorless. What you're looking at is a reflection of the sunlight as it bounces off the water crystals in the upper atmosphere, and that appears to be blue. But the sky appearing to be blue is not the same thing as saying that it is blue. So when we say those things to a child, that is a temporal or a subjective truth. For example, a person that can't see blue might see that as what we would determine to be a color red, whatever it happens to be. And yet the sky is real. It's just when we put an appellation on it that tries to describe it in terms of color, we get into trouble. And there's any number of opportunities to explore thoughts like that. Objective truth, which we're going to talk about today, has the four properties that you'll find lined up on your screen, in the center of the screen. Objective truth, rule number one: truth can contain no falsity. It's a simple matter of logic. Any of you out there that are into computers, for example, will know that in a Boolean argument, which defines a state of logic, if there is a negation in any place within that Boolean mathematical representation, then the outcome of that equation is false. Consider, for example, when you're designing a computer and you're looking at a NAND gate, which has two inputs, or better yet, an AND gate, which has two inputs. The AND gate says that the output is only 1 when both inputs are 1. You take 1 and AND it with 1, and the result is, in fact, 1. And you could have any number of inputs, let's say 3, which is another common number. If all 3 inputs are 1, which in this case would be true, then the output is true. However, if any one of those 3 gates is 0 or false, the entire output is false. So when we're talking about objective truth, we're talking about a truth that has no falsity in it. So accordingly, if we try to measure our statement that the sky is blue without putting the qualifier "it appears blue," if we simply say the sky is blue, that is not an objectively true statement. If we put the qualifier that says it appears to be blue, that gets a little bit closer to be objectively true. However, appears is not the same for every person, so it remains objectively false. So our first idea is that an objective truth contains no falsity. So here's one of the things that this often comes up to when we're talking about the Bible. If we consider the Bible to be true in its entirety, there can be no falsity within that book. If we consider any sentence or any work of prose or anything like that, and for that to be deemed true, it can contain no lie. Okay, that is the major distinction between an objective truth, which has no falsity in it, and a subjective truth, which may or may not have, depending on how it's interpreted. Our world today generally functions on subjective truth. I have my truth, you have your truth, and if we don't agree, we get into arguments because we've forgotten how to discuss these things with each other. But the fact of the matter is, if we're both talking about objective truth, then we can have an agreement. So how do we know something is objectively true? Well, the second bullet down there tells me that truth is invariant. It doesn't change with the passage of time. So if something is objectively true, it was objectively true yesterday, it's objectively true tomorrow, and in fact will be objectively true forever. It's invariant. And you can think of any number of things like that that might be objectively true for forever. A typical example, a very simple example, might be if we're looking at a parent and a child. If the child is a genetic offspring of the parent, then the child is always younger than the parent. And that will always be the case. A child will also always be younger than the parent. Of course, the provision there is they're living. So it doesn't change with time or with my emotions. Simply because I don't want this item to be true, because I don't like it, I don't understand it, it angers me, that does not negate the truth of the argument. Which takes us to our third rule. Truth doesn't require my understanding or agreement to be true. There are many things in this world that I might disagree with that might be objective truth, but simply because I disagree with them doesn't make them any less true. If I don't understand a concept that is objectively true. That does not make it untrue, simply because I don't understand it. Objective truth doesn't require my consent, doesn't require my agreement, my acknowledgement. It stands on its own. And the fourth thing there we often get confused with, and this is particularly true in biblical context, is when we compare something like a truth with being literal. Two different concepts. Truth is conformance to fact or data that can be demonstrably shown, and in the process of being demonstrably shown is invariant in the result. Literalness, on the other hand, is not necessarily like truth in it being directly attached or similar to something that's objective, let's say. Literalness is conformance to the language involved, to syntax, to definition, that sort of thing. That's where we get into literalness. In other words, truth doesn't necessarily have to be literal, and vice versa. Something that is literal doesn't necessarily have to be true. They're separate things. A lot of people will, in the process of studying the Bible, will say the Bible is literally true because the book is true, and that's a false argument. You can make that statement based upon faith, but in truth, when we're talking about the idea of something being objectively true, that is conformance to data and fact, while literalness is conformance to syntax and word order. And there's a wonderful example of this in the book itself, in the Bible itself, where God classified bats, which we know taxonomically these days as being mammals. Those were classified as birds. Now, either we have the definition of what a bat is incorrect, or if our taxonomy in science is correct, then the Bible got it wrong. However, when we're taking a look at what was involved there was a greater concept, there was a higher concept involved, and as a consequence, a bat could well be considered a bird because it has many of the features of a bird. And if you weren't extremely advanced in your science, then you wouldn't have any way of establishing the taxonomical difference between a mammal and a bird, and therefore you wouldn't be able to make the distinction. So it is not literally a bird, but within the context of what was spoken, it may well be equivalent to a bird, and thus it is true. So this is where we get into trouble with when we start talking about things that are true and things that are false, especially as we get into discussions of biblical proportions. The Bible is true, but it is not necessarily literal. The Bible stands on its own, doesn't require my understanding or acceptance for it to be true. I don't have to agree with it. Doesn't make it false. It just means that I don't understand or I can't accept what the definitions are, any number of things. But it does not make that book false. So I hope this gives us some insight into where we're going to be going. We're going to be talking about things through these series that are objectively true and things that are subjectively true. And I'll try to make the distinction when we come up onto it. And always remember, we are people of the stove, and I'll probably end off with this on more than one occasion. We are people of the stove. And by that I mean, generally speaking, as a species, it is difficult for us to accept something on face value. We have to experience it ourselves. And that's part of the problem with the Bible, because it's difficult in many cases to experience what is being said in the Bible. That doesn't make it false. It simply means we haven't experienced it yet. Like the young child who, after their parent had admonished them, don't touch the stove because it's hot, we touch it anyway. Why do we do that? It's not because we're rebellious. It's because we don't understand what hot means. And so when we get in discussions of Bible doctrine and whatnot, if we have disagreement with it, that's what we need to work on. We need to understand what was truly being said in the context in which it was being said. Okay, folks, that's, sorry for the bump on the microphone. That's it for today. I'll try to keep these short and sweet. I think we're running somewhere around 10 or 12 minutes right now, and that's long enough. So I hope you all have a blessed evening. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of the week. And we'll go ahead and sign off as I bring up my pad here. And go ahead and be well, and we'll talk to you on the next time around. Take care. Bye.